"Stay back, old man. This isn't your fight," the fire captain shouted as Frank Morrison tried to explain why they needed to evacuate the entire block. The warehouse fire seemed routine until Frank noticed the shipping labels and storage patterns inside. As a former bomb disposal expert, he recognized the signs immediately. But the young firefighters wouldn't listen to a volunteer twice their age, not until the building started to groan in ways that meant imminent disaster. Welcome to ANZAC War Stories. Before we begin this intense story of expertise, emergency response, and the moment when experience trumped rank, tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching this video today? And if you believe that knowledge earned in the field is worth more than authority earned in an office, hit that subscribe button. Sometimes the most dangerous situation is when people stop listening to the person who knows what they're talking about. The call came in at 3:47 p.m. on a scorching February afternoon. Industrial fire, Sunshine West, suspected electrical fault in a converted warehouse. For the Country Fire Authority volunteers, it was another routine call-out to support the Metropolitan Fire Brigade's professional crews. Frank Morrison was hosing down his garden when the pager went off. At 78, he'd been volunteering with the CFA for 15 years, ever since Margaret had suggested he needed something to keep him busy in retirement. He'd never told them about his military background, just listed his age, address, and willingness to help during his application. Frank pulled on his yellows, the distinctive protective gear that marked him as a volunteer rather than career firefighter, and drove his aging Holden to the fire station. By the time he arrived, 2 other volunteers had already loaded the pumper truck: Steve Chen, 45, a local mechanic, and Dave Walsh, 52, recently redundant from Ford. They'd worked together for years, these 3. Frank was the quiet one who always volunteered for the dirty jobs. Steve was the technical expert who could fix any equipment, and Dave was the natural leader who coordinated with the professionals. A good team, but distinctly second tier in the eyes of career firefighters. The warehouse was in full flame when they arrived. MFB crews had already deployed, attacking the fire with practiced efficiency. Captain Mark Stevens, 35, commanded the scene with the confidence of someone who'd graduated top of his fire college class and led hundreds of similar operations. Frank's crew was assigned support duties, establishing a water supply perimeter, keeping civilians back, the unglamorous work that freed up the professionals for actual firefighting. Standard protocol for volunteers supporting career crews. But as Frank helped establish the outer cordon, something caught his attention. Through the smoke and chaos, he'd glimpsed shipping labels and storage markings inside the warehouse that made his blood run cold. Military contractor logos, hazardous material placards, storage patterns that screamed ordnance. Frank approached Captain Stevens, who was coordinating the internal attack from his command post. "Captain, I need to tell you something about what's stored in that building." Stevens barely looked up from his tactical display. "Not now, mate. We've got this under control." "Sir, I think there might be explosive materials in there. I saw shipping containers with military markings." "Listen, old-timer," Stevens cut him off. "This is an electrical fire in a converted warehouse. We know what we're dealing with. Why don't you stick to crowd control and let the professionals handle the dangerous stuff?" Frank tried again. "Captain, I have some experience with military ordnance. Those storage patterns I saw inside." "Experience? Like what, watching war movies?" Stevens's tone was dismissive. "I've got 20-year veterans in there doing the real work. No offense, but this isn't a job for weekend warriors." Frank stepped back, stung by the dismissal, but not surprised. He'd faced similar attitudes from younger people throughout his civilian life. The assumption that age equaled obsolescence, that volunteers couldn't possibly know more than professionals. But this was different. This was life and death. Frank circled the building's perimeter, using his volunteer access to get closer than civilians could. What he saw through the smoke-blackened windows confirmed his worst fears. Stacked containers marked with military contractor codes, shipping labels indicating explosive ordnance disposal training materials, storage methods that followed patterns he recognized from his decades in bomb disposal. This wasn't just a warehouse fire. It was a potential catastrophe that could level 3 city blocks. Frank returned to Captain Stevens's command post, more urgent this time. "Captain, you need to evacuate your crews immediately. That building is storing military explosives." Stevens turned on him angrily. "I told you to stay back. We're trying to coordinate a complex operation here, not listen to some volunteers' conspiracy theories." "Sir, I'm telling you as someone who knows explosives." "As someone who knows what? You're a 78-year-old volunteer firefighter. You don't know the first thing about hazardous materials or structural firefighting. This is why we don't let volunteers make tactical decisions." Other firefighters had gathered, drawn by the raised voices. Frank could see their expressions: amusement at the old volunteer trying to tell professionals their job, irritation that he was disrupting their operation. But Frank had seen what he'd seen, and his training, dormant for decades but never forgotten, was screaming warnings that couldn't be ignored. "Dave," Frank called to his crew leader, "we need to evacuate everyone in a 3-block radius, now." Dave Walsh looked between Frank and Captain Stevens, caught between loyalty to his volunteer crew and deference to professional authority. "Frank, what are you talking about? That building is storing enough ordnance to create a blast radius that'll take out everything from here to the shopping center. I know because I've seen it before." Captain Stevens had heard enough. "Right, that's it. You volunteers are obviously out of your depth here. I want your crew to pack up and return to station immediately. This is a professional operation from here on." Frank felt the familiar frustration of being dismissed because of assumptions about his age, his volunteer status, his appearance. But he also felt something else: the absolute certainty that came from decades of experience with explosives and the knowledge that silence would mean unnecessary death. As his crew reluctantly began packing their equipment, Frank made a decision that would either vindicate his warnings or end his volunteer career forever. He walked to the nearest MFB truck and activated the emergency radio frequency used for evacuation orders. "All crews, immediate evacuation. Building contains military ordnance. Blast hazard imminent." This is not a drill. The radio crackled with confused responses. "Who authorized that order? Which command post is calling evacuation? Stevens, what's your status?" Captain Stevens realized what had happened and ran toward Frank, his face furious. "What the hell do you think you're doing? You can't issue evacuation orders. You're not qualified. You're not trained." Frank looked at the younger man calmly. "I'm trained, Captain. 25 years Explosive Ordnance Disposal, Royal Australian Engineers. I know what's in that building because I've disposed of the same materials hundreds of times." The words hit Stevens like a physical blow. EOD 25 years. That was more explosive experience than everyone on the scene combined. You're what? Vietnam, Cambodia, training ranges, civilian bomb disposal contracts after retirement from active service. I've been around more ordnance than anyone here, and I'm telling you that building is about to become a bomb." As if to emphasize Frank's point, the warehouse structure gave an ominous groan, the kind of sound that meant critical support failure was imminent. Captain Stevens stared at Frank for a moment, processing the revelation. Then his professional training kicked in. If there was even a chance the old volunteer was right, evacuation was the only option. "All crews, confirm immediate evacuation. Establish safety perimeter at 300 meters. This is command authorizing emergency withdrawal." The next 20 minutes were controlled chaos as firefighters withdrew equipment, police extended cordons, and emergency services evacuated nearby buildings. Frank found himself at Stevens's command post, no longer dismissed as an interfering volunteer, but consulted as the explosive expert he'd always been. "Morrison, what's your assessment of blast radius if this thing goes up?" Frank studied the building's structure and calculated based on what he'd observed. Minimum 200 meters for primary blast, 500 meters for secondary fragments and debris. If there's as much ordnance as I think, we're looking at damage out to 800 meters. Stevens coordinated the expanded evacuation, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by professional respect for Frank's expertise. Other senior firefighters gathered around the elderly volunteer, asking technical questions about explosive storage, blast patterns, structural vulnerability. At 6:23 p.m., the warehouse roof collapsed inward with a sound like thunder. Moments later, the stored ordnance detonated. The explosion was visible from 15 kilometers away. Windows shattered in a 4-block radius. The warehouse and 2 adjacent buildings were completely destroyed. If firefighters had still been inside conducting interior attacks, the casualty count would have been catastrophic. As it was, no one was seriously injured. In the aftermath, as investigators picked through the debris and documented the cause, Captain Stevens approached Frank with something that looked like humility. "Morrison, I owe you an apology, and probably my life." Frank was sitting on the tailgate of his crew's truck, finally allowing himself to feel the exhaustion that came from averting disaster. "No apologies needed, Captain. You did what you thought was right with the information you had. But I should have listened when you tried to tell me about the explosives." Frank considered this. You know what you should have done? You should have asked me why I was so certain. Not about my credentials or my age or my volunteer status. Just asked me to explain what I saw and why it worried me. Stevens nodded. What would you have told me? That I spent 2.5 decades making safe the kind of ordnance that was stored in that building. That I can identify explosive storage patterns from 50 meters away because my life depended on it for 25 years. That age doesn't diminish that kind of knowledge. It refines it. Over the following weeks, Frank's role in preventing the catastrophe became legend within the CFA and MFB communities. But the story that spread wasn't about the explosion or the evacuation. It was about the importance of listening to experience regardless of where it came from. Captain Stevens implemented new protocols requiring incident commanders to formally consult with all personnel who identified potential hazards, regardless of rank or service status. Frank's intervention became a case study in emergency management courses across Victoria. Frank Morrison continued volunteering with the CFA, but his role changed. He was now consulted on any incident involving potential ordnance, his explosive expertise finally recognized and valued. Younger firefighters sought him out for training, eager to learn from someone with decades of real-world experience. The old volunteer gear still marked him as non-professional, but the respect in younger firefighters' voices when they called him Frank instead of old-timer showed that some attitudes had permanently changed. Dave Walsh, Frank's crew leader, later admitted he'd learned something important that day. I always knew Frank was capable, but I never asked about his background. Turns out we'd been working alongside one of Australia's most experienced bomb disposal experts for 15 years, and we treated him like just another weekend volunteer. Steve Chen, the mechanic, put it more bluntly. We almost got people killed because we couldn't see past Frank's age to his knowledge. Won't make that mistake again. 6 months later, Frank received a formal commendation from the Victorian Fire Services for exceptional expertise and courage in preventing loss of life during hazardous incident response. The ceremony was held at the same fire station where he'd been dismissed as an interfering old volunteer. But Frank kept the commendation letter in his kitchen drawer, next to Margaret's photograph and his Vietnam service medals. More meaningful to him were the phone calls from younger firefighters asking for advice, the invitations to training sessions, and the simple fact that when he spoke at incidents now, people listened. At 78, Frank Morrison had finally found a civilian role that valued the expertise he'd carried quietly for decades, not because he'd demanded recognition, but because a crisis had forced people to look beyond assumptions and see the knowledge that experience brings. The warehouse explosion became a reminder throughout Victorian emergency services that expertise comes in many forms, and that the quiet volunteer in outdated gear might know more about saving lives than anyone realized. So tell us, have you ever been dismissed because of your age, appearance, or status, only to prove that experience matters more than expectations? Have you witnessed someone whose knowledge was ignored until a crisis made it impossible to overlook? Someone whose expertise was hidden behind assumptions until the moment when lives depended on listening? Share their story in the comments. Tell us how they handled being underestimated and what happened when people finally paid attention. Because here at ANZAC War Stories, we believe that real expertise isn't about titles or status. It's about knowledge earned through experience, especially when that experience could save lives. Subscribe to make sure these stories of overlooked wisdom and quiet competence continue to be told. And remember, sometimes the person everyone dismisses as just a volunteer has been dealing with life and death situations longer than anyone else in the room, lest we forget.